Welcome everyone to Renaissance Lives. And today the session is on Tycho Brahe. I would like to say at the beginning that the main approach of this series is to look at biography, taking the individual not so much as a center point, than as a kind of a filter through which traditions are transmitted, challenged, or reinvented. And an excellent example of this is the book we are going to discuss today, which you can see on my screen, Tycho Brahe, or The Measures of Heaven, with the author John Robert Christianson, who is Emeritus Professor at Luther College in Iowa and a distinguished historian. Now, very briefly, in the history of the science of the stars, the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, 1546-1601, to give you his date, Tycho is an intermediary figure between Copernicus and Galileo. He is the one who first, I think, established that apart from correct calculation, you absolutely need correct observation to begin understanding the sky. And for this purpose, he designed and improved many scientific instruments and built the first observatory. Now, this obviously cannot be the work of a single individual, but rather of one whose ideas and goal can only be accomplished when extended in an entire research team. And in this respect, Tycho is often credited for founding the first research institute, so it is very appropriate to discuss him in the Warburg Institute, which was also founded to explore the ideas of its main founder, Abbe Warburg. To discuss the life and work of Tycho, I am joined by Professor Charles Burnett of the Warburg Institute, who I'm sure is familiar to many of you, and whose lifetime work on the history and transmission of knowledge from the classical and Arabic world to the West includes many contributions to the history and understanding of the so-called science of the stars. So, without further ado, the microphone is yours, Charles.
Thank you very much, Francois. Well, without further ado, I should say, I really enjoyed reading this book. Not only is it written very clearly, but it's also illustrated very beautifully. And so it's a real joy to have this book in one's hands. John, who's going to appear on the screen in a moment, says in his introduction that there have been many books written on Tycho Brahe. And I wonder if you could start by just saying, why did you then decide to write a book on Tycho Brahe? What is there still to say? And why do you think we should be reading the book?
It turns out that there is a great deal still to say. The modern watershed, I think, in writing on Tycho Brahe was Victor Thoren's massive book, The Lord of Uraniborg, which appeared in 1990. I contributed to that book because I'm a social historian, and Vic was a mathematician and historian of astronomy. And so my job on that book was to try to put Tycho in the context of his times. And then I wrote another book in 2000 on Tycho's Island that focused on this question of Tycho Brahe's co-workers. I found as many as 100 of them, including some very famous individuals. So that much work had been done when in 2001, a conference was held in Prague to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Tycho's death in that city in 1601. And lo and behold, a group of scholars from around the world came together in Prague and found all kinds of new things to say about Tycho Brahe. It was amazing. I also went to Copenhagen that year and spoke at the Niels Bohr Institute on Tycho's legacy, and found that in Denmark too, there were lots of scholars interested in Tycho Brahe. So it turns out that everything hadn't been done. And then things kept piling up. In 2003, a museum of Tycho Brahe was started on the site of his observatory on the island of Bane. And some conferences were held in anticipation of that museum. And so we got together with, once again, a number of scholars who brought new insight into an understanding of Tycho Brahe. And then Denmark decided in the year 2006 to celebrate what they called the Renaissance year. And this year of the Renaissance in Denmark, the prime event of the celebration was a tremendous exhibit centered on Tycho Brahe at the Danish National Museum. And of course, a number of new publications came out at that time. Well, here we were in a bewildering array of new insights into the work of Tycho Brahe. Around that same time, I was invited to speak at a conference in a field that was new to me, the field of court history. The conference was in Southern California, and somebody had dropped out, and I was pulled in at the last minute, because it turns out that Tycho Brahe had a lot to do with court history. And so I came to that conference and filled in and got interested in the people I met there and in the field of court history. And so in the next dozen years or so, I really drifted into the field of court history and did lots of reading and research in that field, met some very interesting scholars, and participated in a number of conferences in America and in Spain and Italy, in Denmark, on that field. And suddenly the role of Tycho Brahe as a court historian, as a courtier, opened up to me in new ways. So there was something that needed to be written about. I was also interested in a series of personal relations that he'd had. His relations with the woman who was not a courtier, not a nobleman, but who became his wife, his common law wife.
Yeah, Kirsten.
His relations with Johannes Kepler, been discussed from many different points of view. I thought that looking at their personalities could allow me to see them in a slightly different way. His relationship with King Christian IV, who really forced him to leave Denmark, and that king's counselors. So here were a series of personal relations. And so to make what's turning out to be a long story suddenly short, I had many reasons to want to write a book about Tycho Brahe. And when I was asked to contribute to this series on Renaissance lives, it seemed an ideal format for that book.
Well, I suppose Renaissance lives forces you or encourages you to pay attention to the characters in your story, and they really come out, they come alive.
Yes, and in fact, I am, of course, a social historian and not an historian of science, strictly speaking. So that's the end of things that interests me primarily.
Yes, yes. And from the point of view of these lives, I mean, so many of these people belong to noble families, the Brahe, the Bille, the Thott, the Oxe, and so on. And they had many relations with the government, with other nobility, with nobility in other lands and that sort of thing. From the point of view of the history of science, what effect do you think Brahe being a member of the high nobility, indeed, in Denmark, had on his scientific experiments? How did this make him different from other innovative scientists?
Noblemen certainly considered themselves to be different from other scientists. Tycho Brahe certainly did. You can't leave your social status behind, even when you are drawn by your personal inclinations to a field that seems to be outside the scope of your class.
He wasn't allowed to teach, for example, was he? Really? That was in Dig.
He did. He taught for a while at Copenhagen University, taught for about a semester or so.
Yes.
And found it interesting. He did recruit one of the key members of his staff, but that wasn't his approach. He didn't want to be a university don. No. He wanted to administer as his ancestors had always done. His father was castle warden of the castle right across the sound from Kronborg Castle, Shakespeare's Hamlet, the site of Shakespeare's Hamlet. And he and every member of his family was an administrator of their own personal estate and of crown estates. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to lead people, direct people, administer property. He knew how to do that, and that was how he did science. And this was really why I suppose he invented big science before its time, before anyone else was ready to pick up the challenge of doing that kind of thing, administering or integrating teams of technicians and theoreticians to work towards common enterprises. There were learned academies in those days, of course, but they didn't have a clear, strong central leadership as Tycho's Institute did. They weren't a group of people working towards to solve common problems. And so that was the role of a nobleman, and it was the role that he brought to science.
But nevertheless, he was in correspondence with many scientists who outside Denmark, and I get the impression from reading the book that letter writing was really quite important.
Yes, it certainly was. He was a great correspondent, and the book of letters that he published was very interesting because it was correspondence between 3 individuals, and they were chosen because they shared interests with one another and shared ideas with one another, but they came from completely different social classes. One of them was the prince, the Landgrave of Hesse Castle, Prince William, Landgrave William IV. The other was this great aristocrat, this nobleman, Tycho Brahe, and the third was a commoner, Christopher Rotman by name, who was an astronomer, but they shared that common interest. And I believe that Tycho deliberately focused on the ability of an interest in science to cut across class lines and to unify people in common endeavors, regardless of their social background.
But the danger of letters is that you could also have letters from your enemies and your rivals. And we have quite a lot of that too, don't we?
And sometimes you don't get much response. He wanted to draw a young Italian astronomer by the name of Galileo into his network of correspondence. Galileo wasn't interested. And so Kepler joined the group, and so did many others all across Europe. And in fact, Adam Mosley has written in particular on Tycho's correspondence about how he made his island the hub of European communication on astronomy.
Yeah, it really was the most important place in Europe for, it's rightly described as the hub. Am I right in thinking that because of all his correspondence and because of what you said just now, Tycho Brahe's wanting to manage things, the ideas of intellectual property rights, of actually being in possession of your knowledge and not letting other people steal it, as it were, or pretend that they got there first, it's quite an important part of what Brahe did.
Well, it certainly is, because the most important thing to a nobleman is honor, after all.
Yes.
He lives in a culture of honor and prestige, and intellectual property bestows honor. So we think of intellectual property today as having monetary value. That wasn't the way Tycho Brahe thought. He wasn't interested in making money on his books or on his innovations. He was interested in the honor that came from being recognized for them. And so that was why intellectual property rights were important to him. But at the same time, he was also interested in sharing ideas. He did not want to maintain astronomical knowledge in secret, as knowledge of his other great interest, chemistry, tended to be in those days. And he wanted people to share their knowledge. And of course, this is the thing behind the correspondence. The incentive for the correspondence was to share knowledge. Along with the letters, frequently came packets of observations, notes on observations, or drawings and diagrams of instruments, and other material that supplemented the letters. He was very much in favor of sharing knowledge, but at the same time, he wanted recognition for his innovations, and thought that anyone who did that should have that recognition. On the other hand, of course, he did also like to borrow ideas from other people, and at the same time he was sharing his ideas and his correspondence. He did pick up very good ideas from visiting others and from the letters that others sent to him.
Remind me, was he also sharing knowledge from Central Asia and from the Far East, because such information was starting to percolate back into Europe?
Yes, he had no contact with the Ottoman astronomers or any of the Asian astronomers that I'm aware of. No. He was interested in sending an expedition to Egypt because he wanted to check the latitude and longitude of sites there, but he never made much progress on that plan. He had hoped to have his eldest son lead that expedition, but he thought his son had to learn Italian first, because that was an important language of commerce in that part of the world.
Yes.
So he sent him off to Italy to learn Italian. Well, then when Tycho Brahe died rather prematurely, his son came home and never did finish his studies of Italian, or never did go to Alexandria.
Yes. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but you don't actually weigh down your book with mathematical calculations and so on, but instead you give illustrations of all these wonderful astronomical instruments that Tycho built.
Yes.
And we have examples here. And this, well, at least they excite the imagination, so we can imagine that the observations made by these instruments were very accurate and helped him to make his dark table and his calculations of the parallax and all that sort of thing. But you don't give all these calculations yourself, partly, I suppose, because they've been given by other historians of science.
No, I was fortunate to collaborate with Victor Thoren, who knew all about that, knew how to do those things. And I must confess that that's beyond my realm. And so I've left that part of Tychonic studies to others. Christian Mosko is also who died recently in Denmark, was also a person whose works I used in trying to get a grasp on the technicalities of Tycho's astronomy. And of course, there are many others, Owen Gingrich and many others who've written about.
But is it true to say that you probably provided the largest selection or collection of illustrations of these instruments
in
one book?
Yes, they're all in there, and it really grew out of a project that Vic Thoren started, where he set out to determine the chronology of the instruments. And Owen Gingrich was also interested in the particular use of a given instrument. What did you use an instrument like this one, an equatorial armillary, an instrument that Tycho in fact invented? It was the first one to make this instrument. What did you use it for? Why did he make it? So Gingrich and especially Thorin had studied the instruments, and I discovered a few things. I used basically the same technique that Thorin used. I looked for the instruments in the observational journals, and then tried to see when they were used. But I thought that more could be done than Vic had a chance to do it before he died prematurely. And so I wanted to follow up on that and to follow the progress of the instruments as they evolved. And I thought it was necessary to have pictures of all of them. And so this was one of the things that inflated the number of illustrations in this book. I hope to the advantage of the reader. It certainly was amazing to me to see them in print when I saw the book for the first time, because these are such beautiful illustrations and they were printed so well. But I think of the roughly 100 illustrations in the book, about 40 of them, well over a third, pushing towards a half of them are of the instruments. And here you can see in great detail, this instrument is like a model of the Earth. This part, the semicircle on the outside of the instrument follows the equator. And the axis of the instrument running from the ball on the bottom up towards the top is the axis of the Earth. And so the instrument can be swung around on that axis to follow any line of incorporate any point on the Earth, on the heavens as projected outwards from the Earth. So this is an instrument that uses the equatorial coordinates, which are the standard coordinates of astronomy today. It's not that they were unknown before Tycho Brahe, but he was the one who made them his standard coordinates, and they have been ever since. It was another one of his contributions to the history of astronomy, to establish the equatorial coordinates as the fundamental ones. The interesting things about them is that they are the coordinates that do not refer to the zodiac, that are not based on the zodiac. And so in that way, they took a step away from the coordinates of astrology.
He took a step away from the coordinates of astrology, if I may come in. But still, he thought that the Earth was at the center of the universe and the sun was turning, but then the planets were turning around the sun. So it's a kind of intermediary understanding of the sky, or is that a correct observation?
Yes, it is. And this was partly because Tycho Brahe, more than previous astronomers, was so obsessed with observation. In fact, most astronomers in his day didn't bother observing very much. They just turned to the traditional tables to find out where stars and planets and the sun and the moon were located. There wasn't any need to go out and strain in looking at the sky at night when you can find the information in the tables. They made an essentially uncritical acceptance of the database that was available. And this was why Tycho Brahe compiled the first new star catalog since antiquity, because to him, astronomy was observation. It was a kind of an obsession with him. Started out when he was very young. He just fell in love with observing the stars. Owen Gingrich used to hold up a volume, a 17th century collection of astronomical data, and he would say, here are the pages about this thick that contain all the observational data of astronomy up to the time of Tycho Brahe. And here are the observations of Tycho Brahe,
Yes.
far out,
Yes.
outstretching the total corpus up to his time. And so if your love of astronomy is a love not of astronomical tables, not of astronomical theories, not even of astronomical data, but just simply of the stars, the heavens themselves, you develop a kind of a physical sense of the heavens. You look at the moon, it's not a little point, it's not a couple of figures, it's not a position on the coordinates, it's a big round thing. It's not quite as big as the round thing that Galileo, 8 years after Tycho's death, was able to show with his telescope, but still there's a physicality to it. There's a physicality even to the stars. They have different magnitudes. And Tycho, when he thought about this physicality of the universe, he became aware of the fact that compared to the sun, the Earth was tiny. Compared to the stars, this terrestrial sphere is insignificant. He emphasized that even comets were immense objects. And this was, once again, an outgrowth of his obsession with observation and this physical sense of the universe. It was this physical sense of the universe that he communicated to Kepler and that became so important in Kepler's own work. And so there, if you're thinking of the Earth as a vantage point, as the place from which we look at the stars, then we can build an instrument like the one we're looking at, and that represents that vantage point. But we need, at the same time, to remember that this universe that we're looking at is immense. It's huge. The objects in it dwarf our little position of observation.
Yeah, I think that even the sun compared with the stars was regarded as being rather small.
Yes.
Why didn't he invent or take up the telescope then, if he wanted to observe very carefully what was going on in the heavens?
He certainly would have if he'd seen what the Dutch lens grinders were doing. If he had been there when the news started spreading around, he certainly would have. There's no doubt about that. And he would have undoubtedly have mounted telescopes on instruments like this one. It was another Danish astronomer who, for the first time, put crosshairs on a telescope. And made it an instrument for sighting. Because in the early years after 1609, after Galileo's discovery of the telescope and telescopic view of the heavens, people were more interested in qualitative observations of the heavens, in the surface of the moon and things like that, than they were in mathematical coordinates. It took almost a generation before the telescope was used as a sighting instrument on objects like the big quadrant at Greenwich, for example, and other quadrants on Meridia in other parts of the world.
One thing that's really impresses and pleases me is the color in the illustrations. Now, is this because, I mean, the original illustrations in the printed books would have been colored? Is this because because Tycho had enough money to pay for really good publications in which color could be used, because it wasn't used by very, very widely as far as I know at this time.
This was a particular. These illustrations came from a volume that was intended for the Archduke of Tuscany, and is now in the Royal Library in Copenhagen, and was intended to be sent there. So it was one of those presentation copies that Tycho had made. We can only imagine what the one looked like that he handed to the emperor when he met Emperor Rudolph. But he made these very finely illustrated, finely painted versions as presentation copies.
And these were actually printed on Uraniborg, were they?
No, these were the mechanical, the book of the instruments. Some of the woodcuts came from Uraniborg and had been made there. Then there were some additional engravings that were made in Hamburg, and the book was printed when he was at Wandsburg in.
Oh yes, yes.
Yeah, so it's printed there.
Yes,
yes. Illustrations. Here's another illustration. This one is the lost picture of Tycho Brahe's Uraniborg, the first woodcut that he had made of it.
Yes.
It was supposed to have been in the book, and unfortunately, we got the wrong illustration in the book. But this particular one shows a little portal in front of the building, dead center, projecting outwards from the building, with a little platform on the top of it.
Yes.
You could how you got out to that platform is more than I can imagine, because the little window opening to it would hardly allow a portly gentleman like Tycho Brahe to make his way out there. But in any case, he later put a dome on that structure, and I think we have another picture of Uraniborg in color, showing it. There it is, with the dome on top of that structure. But do you want to talk about this illustration when we have it up, or
why not? Yes.
This was his observatory, sometimes called a castle. He called it Urania's Castle, dedicated to the muse of astronomy. It was really more like a villa in the sense of a place withdrawn from the center of power, a place of contemplation and aristocratic lifestyle. It certainly was that, but at the same time, it was a prototype observatory. Under those domes on either side of the round projections of the square building are instruments. Those pointed roofs would slide away, would swing open, and the instruments would be open to the heavens. And then there are smaller ones on columns outside of the two larger platforms. And then even in front of the larger one is a little platform where a portable instrument could be set up. All of these things were very wobbly, very unstable. The whole structure was built on one of the high points of this windy little island, where the winds came sweeping in from the North Shore, heading to the Baltic Sea. And so it turned out to be a very bad place to have an observatory. The instruments were very unstable, and it became an elegant residence, but the observatory was very quickly moved to another location. Up at the top was a room with windows all the way around that could be entered, a sort of a portico. But there was a light column running all the way down through the building from that the tower and the central tower, so that there was a light shaft going down to a fountain in the center of the building. It had running water, and we can't see the fountain from here, nor do we have an illustration of it. But it was there right behind the main door. This building was also unusual in that the rooms within the structure were separated by corridors, very unusual in the 16th century. The corridor, the usual procedure was to move from room to room. But Tycho, I think he'd seen corridors in Italy when he'd been and had been.
If I may briefly intervene, from your description of Uraniborg in your book, it seems to be a place where a Renaissance court, like the court of the Cortegiano in Castiglione, meets the world of science. It seems to be very much Renaissance court culture, as you describe it, with that complex iconography, with this dinner party where you invite famous guests, where people sing, recite poetry, improvise. Can you tell us a bit more about this encounter of court culture and scientific culture?
You see behind me a couple of 16th century engravings that are in the book. One of them is Tycho's island, and in the very center of the island is Uraniborg, his castle. It's illustrated up here as well. And the other picture is a picture of the Sound. The Sound is a narrow waterway running from the North Sea through the Kattegat and Skagerrak into the Baltic Sea. Tycho called it the Hellespont of the North. He loved classical allusions. And the great Hamlet's castle, the castle of Kronborg, was here. And within sight of that castle was Tycho's island. Right there. And so it was centrally located within sight of the castle, and it functioned as a courtly space in conjunction with the castle. The castle was the theater of the realm, really, and the Danish realm was much larger than the little country of Denmark that appears on the map today. The king of Denmark was also king of Norway. He was king of Iceland. He had claims to Greenland, so he had a realm that extended into the new world. And in the other direction, it included a number of the islands in the Baltic, all the way over to what is today Estonia and Livonia. So it was a large realm. The southern, what is today the southern tip of Sweden, was also part of this realm. And the king of Denmark thought of himself, or rather I should say, Tycho kept telling him he should think of himself as the kind of sea king, the Neptune of the northern seas. And Neptune becomes the icon of a great fountain that Tycho arranged to have built in Nuremberg, one of the great fountains of the 16th century. Unfortunately, it was dismantled in the 17th century. And so here's a theater of the realm then, witnessing the power of the king of this great sea realm. And at the same time, a great king has to have not only a center of power and a well-fortified castle to guard these straits. I should add that he also collected dues from every ship that sailed through the Baltic into the rapidly increasing commerce from Western Europe into the Baltic Sea. So it was important in terms of the revenue of the realm. But a castle of great splendor also has to have a place of wonders and treasures. In German called a Kunst- und Wunderkammer. And Uraniborg becomes the center of the treasures of this castle. So that when you visit the castle, as Lord Willoughby did in 1582, or I think it was, or maybe before, to bestow the Order of the Garter on King Frederick II. He is entertained in one of those great banquets at Kronborg Castle, where the cannons on the rooftop actually were discharged every time a toast was drunk, and where the banquet, according to Thomas Muffet, who was there, lasted for 7 or 8 hours. After that banquet, when they recuperated from it, they all sailed out to the island of Vane to see the wonders of that island. And the same was true when King James VI of Scotland, whom we know, of course, as James I, came to visit Kronborg Castle. He also sailed out to be entertained by Tycho, and I described that entertainment. It's some like in the book. So yes, it is a court space. It serves as a space to demonstrate the wonders of the Kingdom of Denmark, the intellectual wonders, whereas Kronborg had a great collection of tapestries that illustrated images of 100 Danish kings down to the time of the heir apparent when they were commissioned, and a number, and this great Neptune fountain and many other splendors. Tycho Brahe had been the sort of the iconological consultant on the castle, so he had been much involved there. And so the two venues were really one part and parcel of one and the same venue.
And Tycho's elk, who partook in the dining, died of drinking too much alcohol, I gather. But but you locate the whole story within the Danish Renaissance and regard Tycho as being a kind of humanist. We're talking in Italian Renaissance and humanist terms here. How does this work?
Well, Tycho certainly got a humanist education because the curriculum of the 4 universities that he attended, he started out in Copenhagen at the age of 12, and then went on to Leipzig and briefly in Wittenberg and then in Rostock. All of these were Lutheran universities. They had all been reformed after the Reformation in the 1530s for the most part, according to the ideas of Philip Melanchthon. Philip Melanchthon, of course, was one of Martin Luther's colleagues, one of his best friends. He was a professor of Greek and Hebrew. He was a humanist. And he instituted a humanist curriculum in these universities, designed a humanist curriculum first for Wittenberg, and then it was imported to virtually all of the Lutheran universities in Germany and in Scandinavia. So the textbooks were the classics. And instead of reading Aquinas, you read the New Testament in Greek and the Old Testament in Hebrew, and so on. And so, excuse me, so his education was a humanist education, and it took root in his thinking. The humanist ideals of prudence and erudition, piety, and so these became his ideals. He was very much, in that sense, in the tradition of humanism. His approach to the writings on, well, say the New Star of 1572, he collected them avidly as he wrote his own book, but before he did, he read everything that he could put his hands on. He had agents sending him books from primarily from Germany, but also from France and even Italy. And he applied humanist techniques to criticize these works. And so his technique of source criticism built on that of the humanists. His writings were cast very much in a humanist form. The classic humanist literary form of the oration was something that he used on several occasions, including his famous inaugural lecture at the University of Copenhagen. But he also printed orations in his books, and so his whole sense of proportion in building that building that he built was Vitruvian. He drew heavily on the classical literature of astronomy and what was known in Latin of the Arabic literature.
Yes.
So he was familiar with the tradition of astronomy. His love of images was very emblematic, and he proudly described an emblem that he put on the first fine instrument that he was able to build after he came into his paternal inheritance. He used maps as not only as icons but as images of ownership. These two behind him. His books were very much in a humanist format, probably inspired by German and Venetian books.
Yeah, including quite a lot of poetry.
Yes, and a lot of poetry, of course. Yes, and Ovid was his model for his poetry, and of course his source for the mythology of the Vane that he created. So yes, I would say that he was very much in a humanist mode. His self-presentation was also, I think, typical in many ways of the Renaissance. His love of portraiture as a way of presenting himself. Instead of having a calling card, you had a portrait that you presented of yourself, and he had painted paintings that he sent to friends, but primarily printed images. And then he chose some of the best artists of his day. When he wanted this image made, he sent a drawing down to Hendrik Goltzius, who certainly was the leading artist, engraver of his day. Goltzius had in his staff at that time a young engraver, Jacques de Gain, who of course also achieved considerable fame. We think of them as Baroque artists or maybe as Mannerist artists. But as you can see, even with somebody like de Gain, whose famous military portraits are manuals of arms and so on are very well known. But even there, he cast his image, the instructions he gave for the image were very much in a more Renaissance style than even in a Mannerist, not to say Baroque style, very much a Renaissance image with that.
So you can say that he, in a way, epitomizes the Danish Renaissance of the late 16th century.
Yes, he does, because there's been a good deal of debate over the question among art historians in particular. Can you even use the word Renaissance when you're talking about a place like Denmark as late as the late 16th century? And I think if we're to talk about it there, what we need to consider is the point at which a place like Denmark stopped just simply absorbing the culture evolving out of, emanating out of Italy a Renaissance culture coming from Italy, and when they begin positively to contribute to the culture of Europe. And certainly that was what began to happen in these years after 1570, as far as Denmark is concerned. That was the year in which the Northern 7 Years' War between Denmark and Sweden came to an end.
Okay.
Started in 1563 and gradually became a war of attrition and finally ended with both kingdoms more or less destroyed by 1570. We have a war like that going on in our very own day right now in Ukraine, of course. But that war was followed by a very rapid recovery. And the recovery was due to the fact that people were hungry in the Netherlands. And the population was growing more rapidly than the source of food. And suddenly there was a need for beef from Denmark. Denmark began to import steers by ship along the coast or on the hoof. And there was a need for the corn that came from the provinces of Prussia and Poland on the south coast of the Baltic. And there was a need for the iron and the copper that came from Sweden. And so suddenly the Baltic commerce is burgeoning in these years after 1570. And recall that the King of Denmark collects a due on every ship that enters the Baltic Sea. And they revised those dues to make them much more profitable in these years. And suddenly Denmark is richer than she had ever been before. And rich wealth tends to produce culture, among other things. Castles and manor houses start going up all over the place. And among them is this villa that springs up on the island of Dane, and the crown is willing to pay and support that sort of activity. So suddenly the contribution that Denmark makes to European culture comes primarily from that island and from the innovations that Tycho Brahe makes, not only in astronomy, but ones that are valuable in science in general. But I mean, even figures writing English drama find it possible to reflect the glory of Denmark and play dealing with a mythological figure called Hamlet, after all. So Denmark is in the news in this.
But then we have this very sad occasion of Tycho leaving Denmark, abandoning Denmark. I don't know if we have much time to talk about his life in Prague and his relationship with Kepler and so on, but this is a completely different environment, isn't it?
It was a sad occasion to him, there's no doubt about that. And the question of why he left, the question of his disagreement with King Christian IV has been discussed from many points of view. I wrestled with that both in my contributions to Vic Thoren's book and also in my book on Tycho's Island, without really finding what I thought was a satisfactory resolution. But I think this time I did find something that to me makes more sense than anything I've seen elsewhere. Christian IV refused to continue the endowment of Uraniborg. You remember that Tycho Brahe's wife was not a member of the aristocracy. She was the daughter of a Lutheran clergyman. And so she came from an educated family, a cultivated family, but not an aristocratic family. And a mésalliance like that did not allow their children in Denmark to be recognized as of the nobility. Both parents had to be of the nobility to be recognized as noble in Denmark. So Tycho Brahe's children were commoners. And this bothered him a great deal. he worried a great deal about the future of his race. And he found a solution in a proposal that the institution on Wien, the research institution that he had established, be permanently endowed by the crown and be headed if they proved to be adequate to the task by a member of his own descent. He thought his sons and the husbands that he would arrange for his daughters to marry would all be people who were trained in the sciences and in cultural activities and who could continue carrying on that work. That was his dream. He convinced King Frederick II that this was a good idea. Privately, he said, he convinced the Queen and even the council that this was a good idea. And they all agreed to it. King Frederick died in 1588 before the idea could be implemented. And so Tycho collected affidavits from all of the others who were aware of the scheme in the top ranks of government, and they all signed on to it. But when he presented that scheme to the heir, Christian IV, who assumed power as king and was crowned in 1596, the king said, no, I'm not going to carry out this scheme of my father. Why not? And not only did the future of Wien as an institution rest on that scheme, but so did the future of his family, of his children. And it seems to me there are a couple of problems here. Tycho thought that the whole refusal was Machiavellian. He used that term. He described it as a Machiavellian scheme. He thought that the advisors to the king, and in particular, the two key advisors, the former master of rents, who's now the head of the government, Christopher Valkendorf was his name, a man who knew the finances of the realm and of Norway and of this whole great realm inside and out, and who had always thought that Frederick II was spending too much money on favorites like Tycho Brahe and tried to rein in the money that went there. Valkendorf objected, and the new chancellor, Christian Fries was his name, the new chancellor was concerned about Tycho Brahe because he represented a new strain in Lutheran thought, a sort of a neo-orthodox, rather rigid theology that looked askance at a lot of the arcane thought of the Renaissance. Was not particularly interested in having alchemists and hermetics and people interested in the sort of lore that seemed to flourish on Wien, having them involved in things that seemed to run contrary to strict Lutheran belief. And so he was interested, and he took Tycho's common law marriage as his weak point and began to attack, in particular, the pastor of Wien, who had not reprimanded Tycho for living with his common law wife, who was regarded now as a loose woman, as a whore.
Yeah. So for all of these reasons,
and so suddenly he comes under attack on that side, and then also on the financial side. So, in fact, what it turns out that both of these people, as far as I can see, really wanted was to transfer viable parts of what was going on in Tycho Brahe's research to the University of Copenhagen, to clean it up in religious terms and to make it more orthodox Lutheran, rather than this sort of ironic, what was called Philippist Lutheran, a much more open view of other religions that Tycho cultivated. He wanted to make it more strictly Lutheran and polemical, and at the same time bring those things into the university. When Tycho proposed moving his...
I'll have to interrupt you a little because I think it is time we open the conversation to the audience and invite the audience using the raise hand button, and then I will unmute you and invite you to ask a question. In the meantime, while you're preparing, you gave really the first part of why you went to Prague, and now is in Prague. And I think one highlight of what you describe in what he does in Prague is all the trouble he has with Kepler, and I think it puts on the stage a kind of a solitary, egocentric researcher that is Kepler against the kind of Renaissance courtier that is Tycho. Is that a fair comparison?
Yes, it's interesting that Nick Jardine edited two works that Kepler wrote during these years, and in the first one, written shortly after he had become associated with Tycho, he described astronomy as in the way that his master Mestlin had taught it, as a sort of a theoretical discipline, dealing with data much in the manner of Copernicus, but also in the manner of the tradition of astronomy. And the second treatise that he wrote after he'd been working with Tycho for a while made him aware of the fact that it was necessary to observe the stars and to collect data, and then it was necessary to examine that data and to verify it. And this, I think, was Tycho's great contribution to the history of science, was his demand that data not only be verified before it could be used, but that it be collected time and time again in order to verify it. That this redundancy in observation was not just simply redundancy, but that was part of the method. Kepler caught on to that, and that it was necessary to have observers. Even though he was nearsighted, he wasn't a very competent observer, but that it was necessary to have observation. It was necessary to verify data, and he made that a key element in his formulation of his laws of planetary motion. The fact that Tycho was verified within certain limits. And Tycho was the first astronomer to do that, really, to verify his data and to determine the limits of reliability of his data. And that, of course, became fundamental to the history of science from that time to this.
Okay, thank you. Well, I don't see any raised hand yet, and I had another question that we were discussing earlier about Kepler, not about Kepler, about Tycho and astrology. And in your book, you explain that he's very much a reluctant astrologer. Like he has to do a horoscope, astrological calendar, but he's very unhappy about predicting the future, etc. So my question was, in the new cosmos that Tycho is trying to map with his observation, is there something left of astrology as, for instance, the influence of the planet on the season, on human temperaments, on the tide, etc.? What remains of that astrological culture in that newly observed world, so to speak?
Certainly, he was quite skeptical of horoscopes, even though he had to continue casting them. He was very disappointed when his sister wanted to learn how to cast horoscopes, and he had to teach her, and she became an avid practitioner of that art. Undoubtedly, Abu Masar's scheme of 800-year cycles based on conjunctions of the outer planets was something that he believed in. And so he did believe that when the year 1603 rolled around, that a new era in the history of the world would begin, and that it would begin in turmoil, and that it would end in a kind of a return to a golden age. He did believe that, and of course, this was reinforced by a lot of the Hermetic thought of the day, and so I would say that was part of it. He did also believe, as Martin Luther did, who was very skeptical also of the astrology that his friend Melanchthon promoted. He believed that God did send signs, and that things did happen in the heavens that were signs sent by God. These were not predictable. When he had to assess the meaning of what we know was the supernova of 1572, the new star of 1572, he finally came to the conclusion that it was not a seed that had ripened as Paracelsus thought it might have been, but that it was a sign sent by God for some specific reason. And he associated it once again with that major conjunction that would be coming in 1603. So there's a broad scheme, and there's a divine intervention. Those would be two things that he did continue to believe in.
Well, I think on this note, I don't see any other question. We're almost arriving at 7 o'clock, so it perhaps is the time to thank you very much, John and Charles, for your presence and the quality time we spent together. And thank you to the audience, and we will be back on the 21st of April, where we will discuss Rembrandt, the painter Rembrandt, with Paul Taylor from the Warburg Photography Collection. Thank you again, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's been very enjoyable talking to you.
Thank you again. Good night, everyone.